Hello again. My name is Becky Ross. In what follows, I teach part 2 of my module Sex Work Under COVID-19 for the COVID and Society course in sociology. I'll begin with 2 introductory slides. Again, the focus on stigmatization, criminalization, and resistance by organizers. The focus of this section is on historicizing sex work in Vancouver, 1890s to 1930s. So we might begin by asking, how does examination of the history of sex work in Vancouver help us to understand what is different from and similar to contemporary forms of stigma, scapegoating, fear, and sex workers' resilience today in 2020? Let's consider Vancouver in 1900, the socio-legal, economic, and moral contexts. Mass violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples, combined with sexualized racist stereotyping and targeting of Indigenous, Chinese, Black women, and others of color. We find criminalization of prostitution, known as a social evil, in the context of intensifying capitalism and white settler colonization. The stigmatization of non-monogamous and non-marital sexual intimacy by anti-prostitution stakeholders in the emergent city. Anti-prostitution entrepreneurs included police, social workers, medical experts, urban planners, and religious leaders who feared sex workers and cast them as unclean, dirty vectors of disease and contagion. And then finally, forms of agency and community building by sex workers help them navigate punitive, dehumanizing legal, medical, moral, and media forces. Sex work geographies in the emergent settler colonial city included outdoor strolls for street walkers, as well as more than 100 brothels in Chinatown, or what became Gastown, were operated by women and some men known as keepers in Vancouver in the 1880s to 1930s. Brothels were embedded in unequal relations of gender, class, race, and space. Brothel customers or frequenters of houses of ill fame were diverse. Some men toiled in the resource extraction industries of fishing, forestry, and mining. Others were middle and upper class businessmen, politicians, and journalists in search of fancy bootleg liquor and the refined company of the fairer sex. Prostitution was a sector where real profit could be made and where women's wages were not as depressed by institutional sexism and the ideology of the family wage as they were for women in mainstream so-called respectable industries. Some women, white and of color, worked in brothels. Others worked alone or in groups of 2 or 3, meeting customers in hotels, rooming houses, or apartments. Not all sex workers worked full-time, and they rarely reported sex work on census forms for fears of arrest or slut shaming. This makes it difficult to calculate the scope and scale of sex work a century ago. Some women combined sex work with other jobs, such as waitresses, domestic workers, laundresses, milliners, or dressmakers. Embedded in the lowest end of the sex work sector in the early 1900s were cribs that employed Chinese Canadian women who experienced the worst of everyday patriarchal violence, whorephobia, and racism. A white woman named Bertie Stewart opened the first brothel in Vancouver in 1867. And also another white woman, Alice Bernard, operated a brothel on Alexander Street in Vancouver. Here's a photograph of it from 1912 in the once thriving red light district. Marie Gomez was another brothel owner. She had a tiled doorway to her brothel in Vancouver's East End in what became Gastown, catering to Spanish sailors. And this is a photograph of the tiled entryway in 1902. A whole range of anti-vice crusaders policed sex work in the city. The leadership included Moral and Social Reform Council, Women's Christian Temperance Union, Young Women's and Young Men's Christian Association, the National Council of Women, churches, and the Good Government League. Sex worker indoors and outdoors were scapegoated by anti-prostitution forces as fallen women, women of loose virtue, immoral seducers, and vulnerable victims to white slavery entrapped by vile foreigners. It was also the case that settler colonial journalists tended to characterize prostitutes as either savvy criminals or debauched women, and these stories contributed to the whore stigma. Sex workers, especially racialized women, were disproportionately more vulnerable to police arrest, fines, and imprisonment than men who were their customers. Sex workers never lacked customers. They lacked safety, security, liberty, and substantive citizenship in 1900, as they do today in 2020. Historian Daniel Francis has written Red Light Neon, and in this history of Vancouver's sex trade, he unpacks the hypocrisy of moral entrepreneurs in the city. Quote, Vancouver's political and social leaders have consistently treated prostitutes as pariahs whose presence was tolerated, sometimes exploited, but never approved. All the while, authorities collected millions of dollars in fines and license fees from sex-related businesses. Official policy oscillated between controlled toleration and moral zeal. And these fines and licenses constituted sin taxes imposed on sexual commerce. The City Archives of Vancouver holds a valuable repository of prison records. These are records of those charged with prostitution-related offenses in the city in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And a selection of these were collected and exhibited at Sex Talk in the City at the Museum of Vancouver in 2013. This is what the display looked like, collected under the rubric of Vancouver's oldest profession. So how might we interpret prostitution-related prison records? How might we interpret or explore or interrogate these records in ways that neither romanticize sexual commerce nor perpetuate a prohibitionist framework that conflates all sex work with exploitation and degradation? For those who sold sexual services over a century ago, the work was not a site of liberation all of the time, nor was it a site of full-time suffering or drudgery. It was a mixture of both, and this mixture would describe the paid work that most of us have done in our lives. For me, the prison records reveal another central contradiction. They reveal that women who sold sexual services were highly desired, some were handsomely paid, and some were respected and protected for their time, skills, entrepreneurial moxie, and grit. Women in the sex industry were independent wage earners and independent contractors back then, as they are now. At the same time, prostitutes known as public women were believed to threaten white patriarchal Christian and colonial values that sought to contain women's sexuality within heterosexual marriage, motherhood, domesticity, and nuclear families. The prison records capture details about the so-called offenders: name or names, age, occupation, birthplace, where sentenced, date of sentencing, nature of crime, police officers' names, and notes about physical description, in addition to photographs. Here is Miss Miller, alias Waite, native of Canada, occupation prostitute, age 20, black hair, brown eyes, medium dark complexion, half-breed, stout build. Arrested October 1906 on charge of street walking, convicted and let go on suspended sentence on condition she leave the city at once. Sentenced to 3 months in jail, HL or hard labor on charge of street walking. So how many Indigenous women worked in the sex trade at this time in the city? Were they more likely to do the dangerous, highly policed, street-based outdoor work, earning less income than inside brothels or sporting houses? Were two-spirits and non-heterosexuals involved in the industry? How did women like Miss Miller sustain kinship relations with sisters, mothers, lovers, children, and friends? In profoundly racist and sexist Vancouver in 1907, what were Miss Miller's employment options? And were Miss Miller's kin from the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, or Musqueam nations? How does her forced expulsion from the city reveal legacies of settler colonial violence, past and present? My own historical research has explored the mass expulsion of more than 200 street-based sex workers from Vancouver's West End neighborhood in 1984. Many were trans, Indigenous, Black, Asian, and Filipina. My research was done with my longtime collaborator, Métis Cree trans sex worker, the late Jamie Lee Hamilton, and all of our work resulted in our installation of the West End Sex Workers Memorial in September of 2016. So here's a lamppost and plaques that commemorate sex workers violently expelled from Vancouver's West End at the corner of Jervis and Pendrell Streets. And another photograph of Jamie at the inauguration of our memorial addressing the crowd in September of 2016. Most women arrested for prostitution in the early 1900s in Vancouver were fined and or sentenced to prison terms, HL or hard labor, 3 months to 6 months in the Westminster Jail. Some elected to do the labor rather than pay a hefty financial price, though months away from the business must have meant a tough restart upon release. Today, small businesses are facing similar uncertainty after months of forced closure due to COVID-19. Trilby Thorne, nationality American Negress, occupation prostitute, age 26, complex quadroon, stout build, arrested 1904, inmate of a bawdy house in default 2 months, fine was paid. How and why did Thorne make her way from the US to Canada? How long did Thorne stay in Vancouver and in the business? Was she a brothel employee, not a madam? How much must Thorne have navigated anti-Black racism and misogynist stereotypes of Black women as innately licentious, primitive, and hypersexual? Prison records also encode signs of transnational mobilities and global circuits of people, capital, and commodities in the colonial city of Vancouver. As well, records supply evidence of the discretionary power of colonial state officials, including lawmakers and police. The late white French theorist Michel Foucault explored modalities of sexual surveillance in the West in his book, The History of Sexuality. Quote, sex gave rise to infinitesimal surveillances, permanent controls, extremely meticulous orderings of space, indeterminate medical or psychological examinations, all the while it generated statistical assessments and interventions aimed at the entire social body or at groups taken as a whole. End of quote. Adapting Foucault, the prison records offer us a window into the settler colonial state's legal interventions designed to punish and stigmatize non-conforming bodies. And the records supply evidence of emerging roots of the police-industrial complex and the industrial complex, two cornerstones of white settler colonial law enforcement. So what happens when we probe the silences in the white settler colonial archive of the records? For me, the limitations of the records are most striking and disappointing. The prison records were manufactured by powerful white settler colonial state agents, paid to apprehend, humiliate, and incarcerate fallen women and unsavory men, and to legitimize and justify ever-growing police budgets and policing practices. We do not have access to the diverse voices, experiences, feelings, and memories of those once involved in sex work. What other primary historical sources might we mine to expand and enrich stories of their lives? We might ask, for example, what measures did sex workers take to guard against unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections? How many sought back healthy abortions or administered their own remedies? How did some live with drugs and or alcohol addictions? How did they cope with disapproving or unsuspecting family members? What harm reduction and safety planning strategies did they implement? Here, I want to introduce 4 prison records from the early 1900s that will form the basis of your in-class writing assignment, a case study. Julia Lebrun, Madge Thompson, and 2 men, Rube Williams, American Negro, occupation piano player in a house of ill fame, and Yet Sun, native of China, age 45, height 5 feet 6 inches, black hair, black eyes, sallow complexion. So what do these records reveal about the legal and moral regulation of prostitution in early 20th century Vancouver? Who was and was not targeted and punished for consensual paid sex acts between adults, and why? Who produced these textual records and early mugshots for the white settler colonial archive and gaze, and for what purposes? Consider hierarchies of gender, heterosexuality, class, race, ethnicity, space, and citizenship. And can we identify early roots of anti-Asian and anti-Black racisms, which have resurfaced during the COVID crisis? Can we name other examples of racist profiling by police and others in our contemporary context? For me, these prison records demonstrate how sex workers' fight for sovereignty, safety, and security remains as pressing today as it was more than a century ago. In part 3 of my module, I turn to the experiences of sex workers in the contemporary context of COVID-19. In this context, sex workers continue to navigate social and economic perils as well as possibilities while facing the devastating loss of income. As workers and human beings, most sex workers continue to encounter stigmatization and criminalization, the two central pillars that combine to intensify their daily risk of social, political, and economic inequality and precarity. In this final section, I will highlight the unique case of New Zealand, as well as efforts by some sex workers to shift to monetizing their work online. This is the end of part 2. Thank you very much.